She had given up on love the day she buried her husband, but everything changed when a desperate stranger with 2 orphaned children stopped at her door, seeking shelter from the storm.
Subscribe to Wild Sky Stories. Turn on the bell icon so you can do not miss any new video.
The sun was setting over the dusty town of Cedar Springs when the stranger appeared on the horizon. His horse moved slowly, exhausted from the long journey across the desert plains. Behind him, 2 small figures clung to each other on a tired mule, their faces dirty and their clothes worn thin. Clara Whitmore stood on the porch of her boarding house, wiping her hands on her apron as she watched the travelers approach. She had seen many desperate souls pass through this town over the years, but something about this particular sight made her heart clench tight in her chest. The man pulled his horse to a stop near the water trough. He was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes that carried the weight of profound sorrow. When he lifted the children down from the mule, Clara noticed how gentle his hands were, how carefully he held them despite his obvious exhaustion. The little girl appeared to be around 6 years old, with copper curls and freckles scattered across her nose. The boy was younger, maybe 4, clutching a ragged stuffed rabbit to his chest. Both children pressed close to the man's legs, seeking comfort and protection. Clara made her decision before she even realized she was moving. Her boots carried her down the steps and across the street, drawn toward this small, broken family like a moth toward candlelight. What should Clara do first? If you want her to offer water, continue reading. If you want her to introduce herself immediately, skip ahead 2 paragraphs. Clara reached for the ladle hanging beside the water trough and filled it with fresh, cool water. She approached the little girl first, kneeling down to her level. The child's eyes widened with uncertainty, but thirst won over fear. She accepted the water gratefully, drinking in small, desperate gulps. The man watched Clara with guarded curiosity. When she offered water to the boy, he finally spoke. His voice was rough from disuse and dust. "We can pay. I have some money left. We just need a room for the night, maybe 2. Then we will move on." Clara stood and met his gaze directly. "I am Clara Whitmore. I own the boarding house across the street. You look like you could use more than just water and a room." The man hesitated, pride warring with necessity on his handsome, weathered face. "I am Elijah Garrett. These are my children, Sarah and Thomas. Their mother passed 3 months ago. We have been traveling ever since, looking for somewhere to start fresh." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them away. She understood loss. She understood the desperate need to keep moving when staying still meant drowning in grief. Her own husband had died 5 years ago, leaving her with nothing but this boarding house and a heart full of memories. "Come inside," she said softly. "I have stew on the stove and clean beds waiting. We can discuss payment later. Should Clara give them her best room? If yes, continue reading. If she should give them a modest room, skip ahead 1 paragraph." Clara led them up the stairs to the largest room in her establishment, the one with the window overlooking the mountains and the soft feather mattress she usually reserved for wealthy travelers. Something told her these children needed comfort more than any rich stranger ever would. Elijah protested when he saw the quality of the accommodations. "This is too much. We cannot accept such generosity from a stranger." Clara turned to face him, and their eyes locked in that small doorway. She noticed for the first time how blue his eyes were, like the summer sky after a storm had passed. She noticed the slight tremor in his hands, the way he kept glancing at his children to ensure they were safe. "Everyone in this world was a stranger once," Clara replied. "That does not mean they have to stay that way." The days that followed brought unexpected changes to the quiet boarding house. Sarah discovered Clara's small garden behind the kitchen and appointed herself the official flower waterer. Thomas followed Clara everywhere like a tiny shadow, his stuffed rabbit always in tow. And Elijah, despite his initial reluctance, began helping with repairs around the property. Clara found herself watching him work from the kitchen window. She observed the way his muscles moved beneath his worn shirt as he fixed the broken porch railing. She noticed how he always stopped to answer his children's endless questions with patience and love. She caught herself smiling more than she had smiled in years. One evening, after the children had fallen asleep, Elijah found Clara sitting alone on the porch steps, gazing at the stars. He sat down beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Should Elijah share his story first? If yes, continue reading. If Clara should open up first, skip ahead 2 paragraphs. My wife, Margaret, she was sick for a long time before she passed, Elijah said quietly. I tried everything, sold our farm to pay for doctors and medicines. None of it helped. In the end, I was left with 2 heartbroken children and nothing but the clothes on our backs. Clara listened without interrupting. She understood that sometimes people needed to release their pain into the night air, to give voice to the grief that threatened to consume them from within. I have been running ever since, he continued, running from the memories, from the pitying looks of neighbors, from the empty spaces where she used to be. But lately I have started to wonder if maybe I've been running towards something instead. He turned to look at Clara, and in that moment, something electric passed between them. She felt her cheeks flush warm despite the cool evening breeze. I lost my husband to a fever, Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. For years I thought I would never feel whole again. I filled my days with work and my nights with loneliness. I told myself it was enough. I told myself I did not need anything more. Elijah reached out and took her hand in his. His palm was rough with calluses, warm and strong and real. Clara did not pull away. Instead, she interlaced her fingers with his, marveling at how natural it felt. What changed? He asked. Clara smiled through the tears that had begun to fall. You rode into town with 2 children and nowhere to sleep, and suddenly my empty boarding house did not feel so empty anymore. The weeks turned into months, and still Elijah made no move to leave. He had found work at the local livery stable, honest labor that allowed him to contribute to the household expenses. The children had started attending the small schoolhouse, making friends and building connections. Cedar Springs was becoming home, but neither Clara nor Elijah had spoken of the feelings growing between them. They shared meals and conversations and comfortable silences. They worked side by side and laughed together and created new memories to replace the painful ones. Yet neither dared to cross the invisible line that separated friendship from something more. Should the children intervene? If yes, continue reading. If a dramatic event should bring them together, skip ahead 3 paragraphs. It was little Sarah who finally took matters into her own hands. One Sunday afternoon, while the adults were cleaning up after the midday meal, she marched into the kitchen with determinati. On blazing in her young eyes, Papa, she announced, you should marry Miss Clara. The plate in Clara's hands nearly crashed to the floor. Elijah choked on the coffee he had been drinking. Thomas nodded solemnly, adding his rabbit's silent endorsement to his sister's proposal. Sarah, Elijah sputtered, his face turning red. That is not appropriate. You cannot simply demand that people get married. Why not? Sarah crossed her arms. You look at her the way you used to look at Mama, and she looks at you the same way. Thomas and I talked about it. We want Miss Clara to be our new mother. She makes good biscuits and she reads us stories and she makes you smile. Clara felt her heart pounding against her ribs. She looked at Elijah, expecting to see embarrassment or denial in his expression. Instead, she saw something else entirely. Hope, longing, love. Out of the mouths of children, Elijah said softly, rising from his chair and crossing the kitchen to stand before Clara. What should Elijah do now? If he should propose immediately, continue reading. If he should kiss her first, skip ahead 1 paragraph. He took both her hands in his just as he had done that night on the porch so many weeks ago. But this time, he sank to one knee. looking up at her with those beautiful blue eyes that had become her whole world. "Clara Whitmore," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "I rode into this town with nothing but 2 children and a broken heart. I never expected to find healing here. I never expected to find you. But now that I have, I cannot imagine my life without you in it. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Clara was crying freely now, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. She pulled Elijah to his feet and threw her arms around his neck, holding him as tightly as she could. "Yes," she whispered against his ear. 1,000 times yes. The children cheered and danced around the kitchen. Thomas's rabbit was waved triumphantly in the air. Sarah was already planning the wedding dress she would wear. And in the center of it all, Elijah and Clara held each other, 2 wounded souls who had finally found their way home. The wedding took place on a beautiful spring morning, when the wildflowers were blooming across the prairie and the sky stretched endless and blue above the little church. Clara wore a simple white dress that she had sewn herself, with flowers from her garden tucked into her hair. Elijah wore his Sunday best, cleaned and pressed and handsomer than any man had a right to be. The whole town turned out to celebrate. The baker provided an enormous cake. The musicians played until their fingers ached. Children ran laughing through the streets, and couples danced beneath the stars as night fell over Cedar Springs. But the most beautiful moment came later, after the festivities had ended and the guests had gone home. Clara and Elijah sat together on their porch, Sarah asleep in her new mother's lap and Thomas curled up against his father's side, the faithful rabbit tucked under his arm. "I never thought I would have this again," Elijah said quietly, looking at his family with wonder and gratitude. "I never thought I deserved to be this happy." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. "We all deserve happiness, Elijah. Sometimes we just have to be brave enough to reach for it when it appears." He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of wildflowers that clung to her hair. "Thank you for reaching for us. Thank you for stopping," Clara replied. "Thank you for being weary enough to need help and brave enough to accept it." The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their first conversation on this very porch. But everything had changed. Since that night. The boarding house was no longer a place of business, but a home. The empty rooms were filled with children's laughter. And 2 hearts that had been broken by loss had found the courage to love again years later, when Sarah was grown and married herself. She would tell her own children the story of how their grandfather had ridden into a dusty frontier town with nothing but 2 children and nowhere to sleep. She would describe the kind woman who had offered them water and shelter and love. She would explain that sometimes the greatest adventures are not about the places we go, but about the people we find along the way. And every time she finished the story, she would smile and add, "That is how our family began. With a tired traveler, a generous heart, and 2 children who were wise enough to see what the grown-ups could not. That love was waiting right in front of them all along." Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and share with friends and family.